Tonight we have a great presentation by Mr. Scott Lefor. Scott is a friend of mine. He entered the seminary to study in the Basel program philosophy just as I was leaving theology to be ordained to come back here. And then when I was sent back the first time for further studies, we met up again there, and just a wonderful, wonderful guy. He is currently an assistant professor of Catholic Studies and the program director of Mary College at Arizona State University. The university there recognizes the classes from Mary College. They have a nice relationship there. And Mary College is the college of the author of the book From Christendom to Apostolic Mission, Monsignor Shea. He's the president of the university and wrote that book there as an internal document in order for the university to kind of understand what its mission was. And it hit the nail on the head so much that it just took off and sells thousands of copies frequently. They've had to reprint it a number of times because people have picked it up and said, this is it. This is what's happening. And they want to come to understand it, just like we're here tonight. So Scott is an assistant professor there, and he works closely with Monsignor Shea, the president of the university, and the author of the book that we're using as the basis for our mission. And he presents on this topic and the topics in the book all around the country. Just a great young guy on fire with the faith, a good dear friend. And so I'd like you to welcome Scott, who's now going to join us, hopefully via Zoom. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Father. I can see you. I'm not sure if you can see or hear me. I think I saw thumbs up, so I'm going to assume we're good. Hello, everyone. So
we can see you and we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm sorry, everybody, for how gray I am. I didn't realize it until I popped up on the screen that there's not a whole heck of a lot to look at. So no, Father Sight, thanks for having me. I'm down in Arizona. It's actually incredibly sunny right now, but it was messing with the camera. So I'm calling in from sunny Arizona. I was originally a seminarian for the Diocese of Bismarck, North Dakota. And so I've never been to New York City, but I've been to Syracuse twice in my life, once in the summer, which was beautiful, and once in the winter, both times to visit Father Sight. The time of the winter, as a North Dakotan, I'm all good with cold, but there was a whole different level of snow that I've never imagined before. So don't worry, you lived up to the stereotype out in Syracuse. So everybody, yeah, I'm excited to be able to speak with you. As Father Sight, I think, gave a good introduction to the book, which is called From Christendom to Apostolic Mission, which is going to be covered, kind of throughout Lent. And exactly as Father Sight said, it was originally meant to be an internal document. We're not a huge university. When you combine everybody on all of our campuses, there's just under 500 faculty and staff. And Monsignor Shea really wanted everybody to know what the university was up to, right? Obviously, theology professors and philosophy professors and Catholic studies professors, are kind of work with some of these ideas. But what about, the faithful nursing professor who might not always understand what the priest is talking about at the pulpit? And so this book was given, 1,000 copies were ordered on the thought that, everybody on staff would be given one, and maybe, they might want to share one with a friend. And last I heard, it's gone for about 500,000 copies at this point. Just because, again, there's something about the book that makes a lot of what we're experiencing really tangible. And so without further ado, let me begin my talk tonight by stating the obvious. And it's something Father Sight just said, and it's something we're all experiencing, is that we live in an age of change. Every society has its own internal divisions and its own tensions. You have political turmoil to different degrees in every society. That's just part of being human. But it seems like the clashes that we're experiencing in the modern day are a little more divisive. They're a little more aggressive, or at the very least, they're hitting on more fundamental questions than I think cultures often deal with. The things we're debating in our culture right now aren't really just, should we tax this percentage or that percentage? But the sorts of questions that we're kind of grappling over are, what is a human being, right? There aren't many cultures that have had to argue about what a human being is. And so again, there's something unique about what we're experiencing. And on top of that, all around us, people are leaving the faith in droves. So people are leaving the faith, and a good number of people who aren't leaving the faith are still kind of only half practicing. Maybe they're picking and choosing what things they want to believe, and so they're living something like a kind of a partial Catholicism or a watered down Catholicism. And it seems like Christian morality, in a very particular way, is on the chopping block with a lot of people, because the moral values that we encounter every single day, the moral vision that we encounter every single day, and the Christian vision of the world, the Christian vision of morality, don't really seem to align, right? There seems to be a difference there. And so I would say even a lot of people who understand church teaching still experience something like an internal dissonance, right? There's church teaching, there's the things that are presented to us as good every single day that oftentimes do appear good and reasonable. And so we kind of have to grapple with this question of why is it that sometimes the church seems out of touch to me? Or why is it sometimes that things the church speaks against seem like there might be a little bit of a reason behind them? So I don't think we need to belabor the numbers here, because I think a lot of us have experienced these realities already. But I think the numbers do shore up kind of what we're experiencing. So I'm just going to share a few statistics from you from Pew Research, which, you know, is a reputable research institution. So the rise of the religiously unaffiliated is well documented. This is something people have been commenting on for decades, but even in just the last 5 years, 5 years ago, 15% of Americans were religiously unaffiliated. Now 20% are. And so we're dealing with millions and millions of people are leaving whatever their faith was to become agnostic, atheist, or simply nothing at all. While 6% of Americans identify as atheist or agnostic, the remaining 14 of those unaffiliated are just that. They're just unaffiliated. They're not atheists, they're not agnostic, they're just nothing at all. And the younger we go, the more kind of dire those numbers get. Don't worry, this is actually a hopeful talk, but you know, when you look at the numbers, sometimes, you know, it gives us pause. The younger we go in the population with these polls, the more true these numbers are. Roughly, it's just under 1/3 of people under the age of 30 are religiously unaffiliated. A number that some of us, again, it's a shocking number to hear, but when we look back at our own experience, I think we think, yeah, that kind of lines up. Americans who have left the Catholic faith, so in other words, Americans who say, I was born into a Catholic family and I left the faith at some point, 48% of them chose to leave the faith before age 18. So those choices are being made very early on. And finally, just the last number I'll give you is Catholics who have left the faith, when they're asked to give various and multiple reasons for why they left the faith. In other words, you know, there's a whole ton of reasons, and they can select 0 or they can select 30. The thing that's selected the most often, especially with Catholics, is I just gradually drifted away from religion. That's selected by 71% of people who at one point were Catholic and have left the Catholic faith. And so I think it can be easy to despair. Obviously, those aren't exactly the numbers we want to be looking at, but every single one of us knows individual people that describes, right? So it's not just that the numbers can be disheartening, but it's people we know and love and we want the best for are behind these statistics. And for generations, this is why I think it can be so disheartening. For generations, families passed on the faith from one generation to the next in roughly the same way, right? Prayers before meal and special occasions, going to Mass on Sunday, going to confession at different liturgical times of year, instilling Christian values, and sometimes, when possible, sending kids on for Catholic education. And it seems like for generation after generation that worked until all of a sudden it didn't. And so a good number of parents, a good number of people, I know this involves my own family, and I would imagine this touches on many of your families as well. The faith was passed on the exact same way, but all of a sudden it just didn't work. And that next generation grew up and didn't continue living the faith. And it wasn't just, you know, their children, but it was everybody's children. It was something that was happening all over the place. And so again, it can be easy to despair. And I think it can be easy to look at all of this with a sense of finality. In other words, I frequently encounter Christians, and I recognize this in my own heart as well, who are bitter and are frustrated about the state of affairs. We're bitter and we're frustrated about the direction that culture is headed. We're bitter and we're frustrated when we see people that we love doing things that we know aren't going to bring them to happiness and don't exactly lead to salvation. And we see them struggling within that muck, so to speak. I think oftentimes that leads us to think maybe this is a sign that the end is near, right? Maybe this is how it ends, is that the church is on its way out and Jesus will save us at the last second. Now, it's true, because God said so, that nobody knows the day or the hour of Christ's return, right? So, the end could be tomorrow, it could be in 50 years. I don't know. I'm not qualified to speak on that. But what I can say is that in the history of the church, the thing that we're experiencing right now has happened plenty of times before, right? This sense of despair that we may fall into, the sense of questioning, the sense of finality, like, how can things get better? They've gotten better dozens of times, right? This is the sort of thing that the church is made to deal with. And so in order to kind of dig into that and to set up the rest of this Lenten retreat, I'm excited that I get to speak to you on this first session on imaginative vision. So yes, I'm saying imaginative as in the imagination, and vision as in sight. And so I think that speaking about imaginative vision, which isn't an incredibly common term, if you put it into Google, you'll mainly just find the book that I'm referencing pop up. It's not an incredibly common term, but as we work through it, I think you're going to be able to nod and say, okay, I know what you're talking about. And I see how that kind of plays into modern culture and modern religion. And so just follow me along, follow me down this road. I promise it'll all tie together. Excuse me, it'll all tie together. And kind of future capable speakers over the next couple of weeks will dig into some of these ideas and apply them a little more. But again, follow me down this road as we explore this concept of imaginative vision. So to start, when we say imaginative vision, I think we can just start with the idea of worldview, right? Even if you don't have a definition ready at hand of worldview, if you and I were in casual conversation and I said worldview, you wouldn't be incredibly confused by that, right? I think most of us just kind of take for granted that each human person has some lens through which they view the world, right? Our experiences, our education, our culture, our family, all of these have formed memories and ideas and hopes and fears and an entire lens through which we view the world. And so, we're well aware that if somebody's had a bad experience with, an institution in the past, they may bring that to the present. That if somebody's had a great relationship with somebody, they're going to treat that person differently in kind of future engagements. In other words, we're just aware that each of us has a certain view of the world that impacts our daily lives. And it's something like the architecture of our minds, right? As we encounter the world, we're not just blank slates being kind of pushed around by the world, but we have rigorous and active minds that engage the world. So to make my point a little bit more clearly on how your worldview impacts you, whether you know it or not, you're just going to have to play along with me because, as you know, I'm not actually physically there right now. And as I talk through this would take too much time anyways. But imagine that I give each one of you a note card. So I hand everybody in the room a note card and I say, okay, write down 10 things that are good. Now, some of you might say that's a little bit vague, but I'd say that's okay. Just do your best. Write down 10 things that are good. Everybody in the room could do it, right? And then let's say we roll out a big whiteboard and I say we're going to go around the room and each of you is going to yell out your 10 things and I'm going to write them on the whiteboard. I think it's safe to say that with the vast majority of things that each of you read off your lists, everybody would more or less be in agreement, right? St. Francis of Assisi, ice cream, puppies, and the sound of the ocean. Everybody would be like, yeah, okay, that seems like a good thing. Now, there are some things that may cause slight problems. For instance, one of the words that I just said was ice cream. Well, perhaps there's a nutritionist in the room who stands up and says, no, ice cream isn't good, spinach is good. And then obviously the ice cream people and the spinach people are fighting until finally it would be figured out, wait. Ice cream is good tasting, spinach is good for you, and I guess some people like the taste of spinach as well. But at the end of the day, we're using the word good in different ways. Wonderful. But there are also terms, and I'm going to give two extreme examples, forgive me for that. There are some terms that if somebody said them, there would be no going back, right? There's nothing that person could say that would make it okay. And so the two examples that come to mind are Adolf Hitler and Nazism, right? If while we're yelling out all these good terms, somebody said that, it wouldn't just be a matter, we wouldn't receive it as just a matter of difference. We would say, this person almost isn't one of us, right? There's such a tremendous difference. You probably wouldn't let that person, babysit your children. You wouldn't really allow that person to be an active part of your life. So what does that all mean? It means that you have a pretty robust idea of goodness in your mind already. In fact, most of you have roughly similar ideas because I imagine you would agree with most of each other's lists. It also means that you have a complex and nuanced idea of goodness because we can debate things like ice cream and spinach and see how they can both be good in different ways. And we all positively exclude the same things. In other words, there's nobody in that room who's going to say that Adolf Hitler belongs on that list. And you know that viscerally, right? It's not unclear to you. It's not up in the air. It's just very, very clear to you. So here's where I think things get a little more interesting. And it starts to drive to my point. After all of this, I tell you to turn over your note cards and to write down a definition of the word goodness that includes everything on your list, that allows for the kind of complexity that, the spinach and ice cream debate had, and that clearly excludes things like Hitler and Nazism. Now, I imagine that very few people in that room, if any, could do that in any short amount of time, right? And I would imagine that if there's anyone in the room who can do it, it's because they studied Aristotle's definition of goodness, like Father Sight, right? In other words, we all have these complex and robust ideas of goodness, and yet most of us couldn't really say exactly what that is. Now, here's where this becomes important. Every single time you make a decision, you're relying on a concept of goodness, because effectively what a decision is a choice between alternatives. You're saying of all the options on the table, which sometimes includes hitting the snooze button and doing nothing, sometimes it includes a whole bunch of different options, sometimes it doesn't include that many options at all. But every decision is a choice between alternatives. And what you're saying every time you choose something is that this one, this choice, or this option is more good than the other choices, or, better would be the word, but it's more good than the other choices. And sometimes, like that's even the case when we sin. Like if you look at, somebody, a great saint like Thomas Aquinas, he's going to say that, even when we sin, it's not because we're choosing evil for evil's sake, but we recognize some partial goodness, like pleasure or power, in the thing that we know is morally wrong, and that's why we choose it. In other words, we choose that thing because in our mind, in some sense, it's good. This is the estimate, you make 35,000 decisions a day. A few hundred of those, this is also the estimate, a few hundred of those are things you really think about. Now, I'm not a mathematician, so I'll just say that 35,000 minus a few hundred is basically 35,000, right? You make 35,000 decisions a day, most of them on autopilot, relying on a concept of goodness that's been there your entire life, whether you've thought about it or not. So let's abstract backwards a little bit. So if you rely on your concept of the word goodness 35,000 times in a normal day, what do those numbers start to look like when we think about terms like truth and fairness and dignity and freedom and faith and hope and charity? So each of us obviously has an idea of what each of these words mean. I mean, even my 4-year-old nephew is capable of saying, that's not fair, or that's not right. And so even little children have some of these concepts in their mind. So the question isn't whether or not you have some definition of those words in your mind. The question is, where did your understanding of that word come from? Because it's driving your life every single day. In other words, does your vision of goodness come from Jesus Christ, or does it come from somewhere else? Does your definition of moral goodness come from Jesus Christ, or does it come from somewhere else? So the point of that goodness example was to get at the hiddenness and power of our worldviews. So now let's move up from this notion of worldview to that of imaginative vision. So imaginative vision, the reason we kind of use that term is to say there's something about saying worldview that feels very static, right? It feels just like a blueprint. It's not incredibly dynamic. And so by saying imaginative vision, what we're trying to get at is the idea that this vision through which you see the world is incredibly dynamic. It gives a texture to everything you do. It is built upon your past and your hopes for the future. It's built along the terms of a story. It's not just a blueprint, but it's something active and alive. And so let me break that open a little bit. When we reflect on our experience of life and our experience of human cultures, we see that whatever our worldview is, in other words, however it is that the human person operates, that the vision through which we see the world is holistic. In other words, it touches on every aspect of our lives. If I, lack confidence, I'm going to lack confidence in, social situations, and I'm going to lack confidence in math class. If I have, aspirations to work hard, that's probably going to impact me across my life. If I believe that my actions have eternal consequences, that's going to impact how I do my homework, whether or not I go to mass, how I treat my neighbor, right? So these visions are holistic, and we don't really need to think about them because we see the world through them all the time. Such a vision, we could say, is also secured by a religion. Religion offers answers to the deepest questions of human life. In fact, it tells us what the meaning of human life is, and it tells us what the structure of reality is. So in other words, as we're approaching the world, the most important questions that sit in the back of our minds that guide our lives are secured by or are answered by religion. Now, you could say, well, what about atheists? And so I like giving the example of Marxist communism, which is atheist. It's actually a pretty robust vision of the world, right? It's not a vision of the world I think anybody needs to accept. I'm not exhorting you to form your life around it. But at the same point, it does, practically speaking, what all religions do. It says what the meaning of life is. It says what the structure of reality is. It says what it means to be human. And even though the answers it gives aren't exactly answers that I believe in, and I don't think they're answers that are entirely helpful for the human person, even something like Marxist atheism, which would never say it's a religion, plays the same role in the human mind. And now we can't answer questions about the structure of reality or the meaning of human life without morality coming into the picture, right? Our vision of what a human person is going to directly relate, or it should directly relate, to how we think human beings should act. And so imaginative vision, our vision of the world, which is going to have at its core a religion, is going to give rise to all sorts of values and concepts that are united in our minds. Values and concepts that we seldom think about, but we always act upon. It's going to give us our definition of what it means to live a good life, what it means to be successful or to fail. It's going to impact our economic vision and our political activities. It's going to impact what counts as entertainment for us. It's going to impact our relationships, and so on and so forth. So to tie it together, I'll quote from the book that we've mentioned, From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. So the quote begins, "To call such a vision imaginative is not to say that it's make-believe. It refers rather to the remarkable human capacity to maintain in our minds much that is not immediately in our surroundings. Humans are capable of transcending the most immediate circumstances of time and place, and of carrying a whole world in their minds, reaching back into the past and going forward into the future, embracing other places and realizing even invisible realities." So here's just a basic way we can get at that. With human eyes, we can't see the fundamental reality of the Eucharist. I can see the host, so I can look upon the Eucharist, but I can't see the reality that I know to be true through faith. I can't see angels. I know them to exist, but I can't see them. Imaginative vision helps us to hold these realities side by side with the things that we do see. In other words, imaginative vision isn't about making things up, but it's helping us to see beyond. Well, I guess that's a full sentence. It helps us to see beyond. It allows us to see angels in the reality of the Eucharist side by side with our neighbor and the monstrance. So the core idea is that it's not just that each of us has a few ideas in our minds, but instead that we carry almost an entire world in our minds. Everything that's ever happened to you, everything you've ever hoped for the future, all the things you've been taught and led to believe, you bring each and every one of those to your daily experience. So I like to offer the example of Moses and the Israelites at the Red Sea. So remember, in the book of Exodus, God frees the Israelites, led by Moses, from slavery in Egypt, and they set out into the desert on the road to the Promised Land. And they make it to the shores of the Red Sea, which is, by all accounts, just a normal sea. In other words, they're not going to be crossing it on foot. Well, when they get to the shores of the Red Sea, they turn around to discover that Pharaoh, who had set them free, has changed his mind. And not only has he changed his mind, but he's brought all of his chariots to kill them. The Egyptians were the most powerful military force at the time, and so the Israelites see with normal human eyes, what I imagine a lot of us would see. They see a obstacle that they can't overcome, the Red Sea, to their backs, and to their front and to their sides, they see certain death. So they look through human eyes and they see what any human being would see, death. But Moses reacts completely differently. So the people cry out to God and Moses and say, why did you lead us out of slavery? At least in slavery, we got to live. You brought us into the desert to die. And so Moses, you'll notice if you reread the text that he reacts completely differently. Moses doesn't doubt for a second, because where Moses and the Israelites see with human eyes the exact same thing, God has changed Moses's deeper vision, his imaginative vision, his vision of human life. Through experience and through promise and through acts of faith, Moses does not look out at the chariots of Egypt and Pharaoh and the Red Sea and see certain death, but he instinctively sees an opportunity for God to fulfill his promises. So he sees the same things in terms of human eyes, but he has shaped his vision of life and his vision of the world, his vision of reality through faith. And so he fundamentally sees, in one sense, the same thing as all the other Israelites, but ultimately he sees something completely different. It's also worth noting, just as a quick note, that the way a lot of this plays out in our minds is as a story. So not only do we have powerful imaginations, but our imaginations often work in terms of a story. We experience life as an unfolding story. God himself, when we look at the scriptures, he chose to communicate to humanity through an unfolding story. Most of the books of the Bible are narrative, right? Most of the books of the Bible aren't philosophic sayings. Most of the books of the Bible are narrative. It shouldn't come as any surprise, not only that God did that, but that a lot of people like me fall in love with things like Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings and Marvel. And now some of you may be saying, I don't really care about sci-fi, but I imagine a lot of you still care about reality TV or sports in a general way, the narrative of the football season. We love stories, we love jokes, we love books, we love movies, right? As human beings, we love stories. And so if you still don't believe that human beings approach life through the lens of a narrative, we don't need to look any further than the example of a quote unquote bad day. So I'm not referring to something that's truly traumatic. I'm not referring to those kind of life-changing days where something truly catastrophic happens. I'm referring to that sort of day that we all have a propensity to have, like once a month, where we wake up and we stub our toe, and then we spill a little bit of coffee. And instead of saying, you know what, I just stubbed my toe and spilled a little bit of coffee, weird that happened right next to each other, we say, no, 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 I'm having a bad day. And for the rest of the day, we overlook the good and we overly embrace the bad because our minds have said the story of today is that things are going against me. And more often than not, you find that to be the case, right? When you decide in the morning that you're having a bad day, you're going to have a bad day, right? Because your mind is going to interpret your entire day, your entire experience through the lens of that narrative. So on a grander level, I think we need to be a bit more aware, not only of the concepts that we carry in our mind, not only of the vision that we carry in our mind, but also of the story that we think we're living, right? Are we living the story told to us by Jesus Christ, or are we living the story told to us by someone else? So what does this have to do with Christianity? So I propose to you that in terms of, well, I've already proposed some of this, but let's make it explicit. I propose to you that Christianity serves as the basis of an imaginative vision all of its own. In other words, Christianity isn't just a set of moral values or an optional cherry on top of an otherwise secular life. As Christians living in the United States in the modern day, and there's a lot of great things about American culture, right? I think we can forget that. We can become pessimistic. There's a lot of great things about the place that we live. But at the end of the day, we can't just be the same as everybody else and go to church for an hour, right? Obviously, if you're here, that's not how you're approaching things. But I feel like it's often a good reminder for me, so I imagine it'll be a good reminder for some of you, that to be a Catholic means to be a Catholic, right? It doesn't mean to be just like everybody else with a little 1 hour a week difference. Because at the end of the day, to embrace Christianity and to live and act upon it with consistency is what it means to be Christian. To embrace some other vision of the world, some vision of the world other than that revealed to us by Christ, is exactly that. It's to embrace a vision of the world presented to us by somebody other than Christ. And so this sets up a key for understanding our present state of affairs. For centuries, the imaginative vision of the West, the imaginative vision upon which our culture was founded, was Christian, right? And so this isn't to say that everybody was always a great Christian, or that even vast majorities of people were living morally upstanding lives. It's not to say that people didn't get things wrong, but it's to say that the core story, the core concepts through which people approached the world were Christian. So in those Christian cultures, the stories that parents told their children, whether they were rich or they were poor, the stories that they told their children were the stories of the saints. Holidays and festivities were built around the liturgical year. In fact, if you look at a lot of medieval holidays, which I imagine most normal people don't, but if you do, if you look at medieval holidays, you'll see even the ones that aren't religious, they bent over backwards to make religious, right? Even the things that they wanted to celebrate, they would bend over backwards to inject with Christian meaning, because everything they did culturally was Christian. But the fact is, we no longer live in that world. The West has begun to embrace some other vision of the world, and I imagine that other vision will be explored a little bit in future sessions. But because the West is embracing some other vision of the world, and that vision of the world, it's not entirely clear yet. It hasn't really coalesced. It contradicts itself a lot. But at the end of the day, the West has accepted some other vision of the world. Now, as Christians, we need to be aware of that. So I'm going to introduce two terms. I know we're coming up to the end. I'll go a couple minutes over. Sorry, Father Sight. I'm just kind of looking at the time right now. So there's two terms that I want to introduce to you. It's that of a Christendom mode and an Apostolic mode. Now, I think it's actually the next two sessions are each is on the Christendom mode and then the Apostolic mode. But the idea is that Christianity, let's define it like this. A Christian culture is a culture founded upon the Christian imaginative vision, right? The core Christian story and revelation serves as the basis upon which that culture is built. Just like an individual human life can be built upon an imaginative vision, or rather, all human lives are built upon an imaginative vision, so too all cultures are built upon an imaginative vision. So a Christian culture isn't necessarily the one that's the most morally upright, that's the most successful. It's the one that's built upon the Christian story. And a non-Christian culture is any culture that's built upon any other story. It may be Judaism, it may be Islam, it may be Marxism, it may be secularism, but any other story. And so a Christendom mode of engagement is what the church employs in a Christian culture. There are certain ways of living and acting, and there are certain pros and cons to being a Christian in a Christian culture. Where we may find ourselves slipping up in the modern church is we've long operated from a Christendom mode because we've been living in a Christian culture. But what we're saying is that the culture is no longer Christian, which means a Christendom mode won't work anymore. Now, it's not to say that apostolic modes are bad, and actually I think it could be argued that the church's default is an apostolic mode. But it can be confusing for us who have been doing things, again, and when I say us, I just mean the American church for the last couple of centuries, has been doing things that have been working, and all of a sudden they don't, and that's confusing until we understand that it's the culture that changed. In other words, when I turn on the TV, when I turn on the radio, when I open a book, if it's coming from the modern culture, if it's coming from Netflix, it's probably not coming from a Christian vision of the world, which means whether I understand it or not, it's presenting something different to me. I like giving the example of Seinfeld and Frasier, because I feel like a lot of people like one of those two, and I love both of them. But you'll notice that every single episode, Seinfeld or Frasier is pursuing a different woman. It's just a running joke. It's like the normal B plot, pursuing a different woman to sleep with her, and then you never see her again. And it's just a running commentary on what adult relationships are like. Well, so it shouldn't come as a shock that if that's how relationships have been portrayed in the media for the past several decades, that that's how people, as they grow up, actually think relationships are structured. And so that's what I'm getting at. When we live in a culture like our own, which is rapidly becoming a non-Christian culture, we have to keep in mind that the things that have worked in previous cultures may not work in our culture anymore. So to live amidst a non-Christian culture, which is kind of our new state of affairs, it requires that Christians make an extra act of will countless times throughout the day. to say, listen, I'm being bombarded by all these different values. And a lot of times these values might even seem pretty Christian, right? It's not that everything that comes from a different worldview is evil, but at the end of the day, all this stuff is united. So it's worthwhile that we're aware of where these things come from. And so countless times a day, we need to kind of readjust and reorient ourselves to say, am I thinking through a Christian vision or am I thinking through some other vision? So again, I don't know that this is a great cause for concern. People that we know are being caught up in this, but I remind you that Jesus wants you in heaven and he wants your loved ones in heaven even more than you do, right? People are being lied to by the secular vision in all sorts of ways, people you love and you yourself. And so as long as we're aware of it, we can kind of dig in and just be a little more aware as we go throughout our day. Am I living my life through a Christian vision or through some other vision? And so I want to close with 2 points that I think are related. They're 2 separate points, but I think they're related. The first is on hope. A Catholic historian by the name of Christopher Dawson, and he was writing about culture, and he predicted everything I just said before World War II. He was writing before World War I and World War II, and he saw that Western civilization was headed in a difficult direction. And he said, when we look back at when the church has had its greatest success, in other words, when the church has truly renewed a culture, it's because the church offered hope when nobody else could offer hope. If you were a Christian living in the year 312, so AD 312, there wasn't a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. The persecutions from the Romans had never been worse. I can't imagine how scary it would have been to live during that time. Things were awful. In 313, miraculously, Constantine legalizes Christianity. Even in the midst of all that persecution, Christians held on to hope because the ancient world wasn't a hopeful place. And so as soon as Christianity got a hearing, it offered people hope when they didn't have hope on offer anywhere else. It's actually thought that in 312, when again, as a Christian, the persecutions had never been worse, that up to 10% of the empire was Christian. And so every time I'm in public and I'm like, a little nervous about what people think about me, I think about the fact that Christians in the early church at a time where you could be killed for revealing yourself to the wrong person managed to convert 1 in 10 people from the Roman Empire. It's absolutely incredible. So why am I talking about this? Well, because if hope is what Christianity often has to offer the world, in other words, if the thing that the world struggles to find on its own is hope, if we're dour, if we're anxious, if we're angry, if we're bitter, when the world inevitably gives Christianity another hearing, if that's what we are, we shouldn't be shocked if the world moves on and seeks out some other hope, a less impressive hope, but another hope. So that's my first point, is that hope is the key to all of this. And for what it's worth, hope is required of us as Christians, right? But keep that in mind when we think of our culture, is that we're not going to win the culture back by being bitter, by being angry. And now let me say a word on vocation in the human scale. So an author by the name of Ross McCullough, who I always reference him because I have no idea where he lives, and I hope someday somebody raises their hand and says, I'm Ross McCullough. So if anyone's in there, raise your hand. But Ross McCullough writes about what he calls the human scale. He says, listen, our modern culture is obsessed with big scale movements. Like we're obsessed with morality in the large scale. Who do I give my money to? Who do I vote for? What causes do I support? But we completely overlook the human scale. In other words, how I treat the cashier at the grocery store, how I treat the barista, how I treat my loved ones when I'm having a quote unquote bad day, right? We overlook that because we think it's not important, but he points out it's completely important. That's not small scale, it's human scale. That's the scale where human life actually occurs. And so I say that because I like giving the example of Saint Benedict. So Saint Benedict of Nursia was a young man living in Rome in the year AD 500. He was about 20 years old at the oldest. And he was living in a Christian culture that was very morally lax. And he was very concerned for the culture. Now, I think what a lot of us would do, and I think what a lot of us think we ought to do, is say, how can I convert the culture? How can I change the culture? But that's not the question that he asked. The question that he asked is, where is Jesus calling me? And as it happens, Jesus was calling him to live as a hermit alone in a cave in a wilderness called Subiaco. And so out to the wilderness goes Benedict. Now, Benedict's movement catches on. A bunch of people end up following Benedict, and he founds all sorts of monasteries. But by the time he dies, it's still unclear what he did for the culture, other than write a rule called the Rule of Benedict to guide monastic life. It's argued today that Benedict is one of the patron saints of Europe. It's argued today that Benedict, perhaps more than any saint, shaped modern Europe, because at their height, hundreds of years after his death, there were 37,000 Benedictine monasteries in Europe. Not 37,000 Benedictine monks and nuns, 37,000 Benedictine monasteries. A monastery is minimum 10, but can be maximum hundreds, right? And so Benedict followed the voice of Jesus on the human scale in his own life, and Jesus used that to build Western civilization, right? And so I just put that kind of back in your court, is that the renewal of Christian culture, the renewal of all of these things that we thought we've lost. First off, we don't need to lose sleep because Jesus has a plan. But on top of that, if we're going to win the culture back, it's going to be because of authentic human hope, authentic Christian hope, and because we're willing to follow the voice of Jesus above and beyond our vision for cultural reform. So I have just a couple discussion questions for you. Father Sight mentioned that I was supposed to give you discussion questions, so I wrote some right when he said that. And so I'll say them slowly, and they're not overly complex. But the first question, it's actually 3 questions, but they're all short. Who am I? Who does the world say that I am? And who does God say that I am? So who am I? Who does the world say that I am? And who does God say that I am? Because the world has one answer, and quite frankly, it's wrong. God has an answer, and quite frankly, it's right. Now, the second question. Do I arrange my day and my life according to what God says is good, or what the world says is good? Do I arrange my day and my life according to what God says is good, or what the world says is good? So with that, I hand it back to your very own Father Chris Sight.
Thanks so much, Scott. That was excellent. Let's give him a round of applause.